There is a photograph taken in 1893 that stops people cold when they first see it. It shows a city, not a sketch of a future city, not an artist's rendering, a real, fully built city, enormous gleaming palaces, colonnades stretching 300 feet in a single unbroken line, domed rotundas rising higher than most cathedrals in Europe. And yet, according to every official record we have, this city did not exist 2 years before the photograph was taken, and within 3 years of the photograph, it would be entirely gone. What you are looking at is the White City of Chicago, and the question that has quietly unsettled historians, architects, and independent researchers for well over a century is a deceptively simple one. How? How do you build something like that, from raw marsh and swampland, in roughly 2 years? How do workers using horse-drawn carts and hand tools raise 14 colossal exhibit halls, each one the size of a city block, each one finished to a standard of detail that would challenge a modern construction crew with cranes and power tools? How do you install the most sophisticated electrical grid in the world, more powerful than the entire city of Chicago itself, on a site that was underwater not long before? And then, once you have built this impossible thing, why do you burn most of it to the ground within months of closing? Welcome to Epoch Reset. I am Elliot Carter, and this channel is where we pull apart the strange, the buried, and the officially unexplained corners of history. If you are new here, hit subscribe right now, because what we are about to go through today is one of those stories where the deeper you go, the less the official version holds together. And I want you here for every chapter of that unraveling. Drop a comment below before we even get started. Just tell me, do you think it is physically possible to build a city the size of ancient Rome in under 2 years using 1893 technology? Yes or no? I want to see where people land on that before we go any further, because here is the promise I am making you right now. By the time we reach the final chapter of this story, there is going to be one detail, one very specific, very checkable detail about the underground infrastructure of the White City that nobody in the mainstream conversation ever really talks about. And when you hear it, you're going to want to go look it up yourself. Stay with me. We are just getting started. The impossible deadline. Let us begin with the timeline, because the timeline is where the first cracks appear. In June of 1888, a bill was introduced in the United States Congress to fund a World's Fair celebrating the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas. The fair was originally intended to open in 1892. That plan had to be pushed back by a full year to 1893 because even the most optimistic planners eventually admitted that what was being proposed could not be finished in time. The schedule had to be extended, and even with the extension, what was ultimately delivered staggers the imagination. Chicago was selected over New York, Washington, and St. Louis, partly because it was the nation's railroad hub, and partly because Chicago's business community made a financial guarantee of $10 million to the Exposition Committee. That selection happened in 1890. Construction formally began in January of 1891. The fair opened to the public on the 1st of May, 1893. That gives you a construction window of roughly 26 months. In those 26 months, according to records held at the Illinois Digital Heritage Hub, the project required more than 40,000 skilled workers and laborers at its peak. The site covered approximately 630 acres in what is now Jackson Park on Chicago's south side, land that Frederick Law Olmsted himself described as marshy and undeveloped, requiring substantial drainage work before a single foundation could be poured. Now let us think about what those 40,000 workers actually built. 14 so-called great buildings, each one a major structure. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building alone was, at the time, the largest enclosed space ever constructed on the face of the earth, roughly 800,000 square feet, with roof arches spanning 206 feet without interior supports. The agriculture building stretched 800 feet in one direction. The transportation building had a 400-foot-long golden doorway arch. The administration building rose to 275 feet, crowned with a gilded dome. Each of these structures was finished on the exterior with what the builders called staff, a mixture of plaster of Paris, cement, and jute fiber, applied by spray painting equipment to give the appearance of solid stone. The technique was ingenious, and accounts from the period confirm it was one of the most ambitious uses of spray painting technology ever attempted at that point. The uniform cornice height across the main buildings was set at 60 feet, creating a visual coherence that architectural historians have since compared favorably to the planned grandeur of Haussmann's Paris. Burnham himself wrote that his ambition was to produce something that looked like a permanent classical city, a city of the ancient world, rebuilt in modern America. Here is what does not add up. The architectural historian Thomas Hines, writing in his study of Burnham's career, notes that the design coordination alone for a project of this complexity, getting 14 different lead architects, including Richard Morris Hunt, Charles McKim, and Louis Sullivan, to produce buildings that harmonized with one another, would typically take years of back and forth. Hunt had designed the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. McKim would go on to design the New York Public Library. These were not men who sketched quickly, and yet the account suggests that major design decisions for the White City were compressed into a handful of planning meetings in 1891. The sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens, who served as the artistic director overseeing the decorative program, famously declared at one of those early planning sessions that what the assembled architects were attempting had not been equaled since the Athens of Pericles. That was not mere flattery. It was a genuine expression of disbelief at the scale of what was being proposed and the speed at which it was supposed to happen. So what are we actually looking at here? Is this a genuine miracle of American industrial organization, as the official history tells us? Or is there something else going on with how these buildings came to exist? Keep that question open, because before we can answer it, we need to look at what the buildings were actually made of, and what the record says about the workers who supposedly built them. Staff, scaffolding, and silence. The material known as staff is the cornerstone of the official explanation for how the White City was built so quickly. And it is a real material with a genuine history, so let us be precise about what it is and what it could actually do. Staff is essentially a reinforced plaster compound, plaster of Paris mixed with cement and fibrous material, typically jute or hemp, which gives it tensile strength. When applied over a wood or iron frame, it hardens into a surface that looks from a distance remarkably like carved stone. It was not a new invention in 1891. European builders had been using variations of similar materials for theater facades and exhibition structures for decades. The Paris Exposition of 1889, which produced the Eiffel Tower, had also used temporary plaster construction for many of its buildings, and the Chicago planners were well aware of that precedent. What makes the Chicago application unusual is not the material itself, but the scale and the finish quality. Writers who visited the fair and published their impressions in the popular press of the time consistently described surfaces that appeared not merely painted, but sculpted, detailed, aged-looking. Henry Cuyler Bunner, the American novelist and journalist who visited Jackson Park during the summer of 1892 while construction was still underway, published an essay titled "The Making of the White City," in which he wrote, and I am paraphrasing here as his precise words are copyrighted, that the whole enterprise had an almost theatrical quality, a stage set of fantastic proportions. But he also provided technical observations that confirmed the genuine complexity of the construction process. The iron arches of the manufacturer's hall, which he witnessed being assembled, were engineering achievements by any standard of the period. Here is where the record gets thinner, in ways that are worth examining carefully. We have good documentation of the lead architects and their high-level decisions, We have newspaper coverage of major milestones. We have the official photographic record, primarily the work of photographer Charles Dudley Arnold, whose images are now held partly at the Chicago History Museum. What we have much less of is detailed, worker-level documentation of the construction process itself. Consider 40,000 workers on 630 acres for 2 years. The workforce included structural ironworkers, plasterers, decorative sculptors, painters, electricians, plumbers, landscapers, canal diggers, and general laborers, many of them recent immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, Ireland. Their wages, their injuries, their experiences were sometimes reported in the labor press of the period. But the comprehensive picture is remarkably sparse given the scale of what was being accomplished. What the archival record does confirm is that the construction was not without tragedy. A fire broke out at the cold storage building on the evening of July 10, 1893, while the fair was already open and running, and the Chicago Daily Tribune reported the following morning in terms that are difficult to read even now. 16 people died in that fire, including 12 firefighters who had climbed to the top of the building's tower and became trapped when the structure failed beneath them. A coroner's jury investigated and charged 4 individuals with criminal negligence, including Daniel Burnham himself as director of works, though all 4 were ultimately absolved. The fact that charges were brought against the chief of construction tells you something about the conditions under which this city was being built and operated. And then there is the question of the underground. This is the piece that almost never gets discussed in popular accounts of the White City, and it is the piece that, once you start pulling on it, refuses to let go. The Exposition site required not just surface buildings, but a complete utility infrastructure: water supply, drainage, sewage management, electrical conduit, and what contemporaries described as a network of underground passages connecting the major buildings. The Bureau International des Expositions, in its historical summary of the 1893 fair, notes that the site's electricity consumption was 3 times greater than the consumption of the entire city of Chicago at the time. 3 times. The whole city. To handle that kind of load, you need a serious underground network of cable conduits, junction points, and distribution infrastructure. Some visitors to the fair described descending into service passages beneath the exhibit buildings. A few journalists of the period made reference to subterranean corridors that allowed staff and maintenance workers to move between buildings without crossing the public plazas. The full extent of this underground network, its plans, its precise layout, its construction history, is not cleanly documented in the materials that are most readily available to researchers today. The Art Institute of Chicago holds the largest collection of Daniel Burnham's papers, including business correspondence, diaries, and project files. But the construction-level engineering drawings for the underground utilities, if they survived, do not appear prominently in the published finding guides to that collection. Now, I want to be careful here. The absence of documentation is not itself evidence of anything sinister. Large-scale construction projects of the 19th century routinely produced incomplete paper trails. Drawings were discarded, contractors kept their own records separately. Site changes were made verbally and never captured in revised plans. That is entirely plausible, but it does mean that the full picture of how this infrastructure was built and by whom is not as clean and complete as the grandeur of the finished product might suggest. What do you think? When you look at the photographs of those underground passages, or the photographs of that electrical infrastructure spreading across 600 acres, does the standard explanation satisfy you? Or does something feel like it is missing from the story? Tell me in the comments. I am genuinely curious how many people have had that feeling without quite being able to articulate what is bothering them, because we have not even gotten to the strangest part yet: the electricity and the man who made it possible. The War of Light. To understand what happened with electricity at the White City, you need to understand the specific historical moment it walked into. The year is 1892, and the United States is in the middle of what historians of technology call the War of Currents, a brutal commercial and scientific rivalry between two visions of how electricity should be delivered to the world. On one side, Thomas Edison, backed by financier J.P. Morgan and the General Electric Company, championing direct current, or DC. Edison had built the world's first commercial electric power station on Pearl Street in Manhattan in 1882, and his system was already lighting parts of New York City. But DC had a fundamental limitation. It lost power over distance and required generating stations every mile or so. To power a city, you needed a network of stations. It was expensive, it was inefficient, and it was ultimately not scalable. On the other side, George Westinghouse, backed by a Serbian-born inventor named Nikola Tesla, championing alternating current, or AC. Tesla had developed a polyphase, AC motor and transformer system that could transmit electricity over long distances with far less loss. Westinghouse had been building and installing AC systems across the country, and Edison had been fighting him every step of the way, including a notorious and well-documented campaign in which Edison and his associates publicly electrocuted animals with AC current to demonstrate its alleged danger. The contract to power the Exposition was, both parties understood, a pivotal test case. Whoever lit the White City would effectively win the argument for the future of American electrical infrastructure. The General Electric Company, according to period press accounts and technical histories of the Exposition, initially bid $1,800,000 to electrify the fair. When that figure was rejected as excessive, they revised their proposal down to $554,000. Westinghouse, armed with Tesla's AC system, submitted a bid of $399,000. The Exposition Corporation accepted the Westinghouse proposal. Edison's response was to attempt to prevent the contract from being executed. General Electric banned the use of Edison's patented incandescent bulbs by any company connected to the Westinghouse bid. The legal restrictions were real and enforced. Westinghouse's response was to engineer a different bulb, a so-called double-stopper design that sidestepped Edison's patents entirely, and produce enough of them to light the entire Exposition. According to records cited in the technical history of the period, Westinghouse manufactured those bulbs from scratch specifically for this contract. On opening day, May 1, 1893, President Grover Cleveland pressed a single gilded button and 200,000 incandescent lamps illuminated simultaneously across the Exposition grounds. An eyewitness account preserved in later memoirs described the moment as watching heaven arrive suddenly on the shores of Lake Michigan. Hilda Satt, who attended the fair as a young girl, recalled in her published autobiography that when the lights came on all at once, it was like nothing she had ever seen or imagined. A vision so complete, it seemed impossible that it belonged to the same world as the city outside the gates. Now here is the technical detail that almost nobody in popular accounts dwells on for long enough. The Exposition's power system was run by 12 1,000-horsepower AC polyphase generators installed in the Hall of Machinery, one of the fair's principal exhibit buildings. 12 generators, each producing 1,000 horsepower of electrical output. Together, they supplied more electricity than the entire city of Chicago was consuming at that moment. The Bureau International des Expositions notes in its historical documentation that the site's electrical consumption was 3 times the municipal load of Chicago itself. Think about what that means for the infrastructure required. Cable running through underground conduit across 630 acres, 200 buildings wired, 14 of them enormous. Moving walkways powered. Yes, the White City had moving walkways, which most visitors had never encountered. Elevators. A functioning electric railroad circling the perimeter. all of it deployed at a scale that had never existed anywhere in the history of the world before this moment. Tesla himself was present at the fair. His exhibit occupied part of the Westinghouse space in the Electricity Building. According to Mark Cypher's biography of Tesla, the display included early AC motors, armatures, and generators, as well as phosphorescent signs bearing the names of great electricians: Helmholtz, Faraday, Maxwell, Franklin. Tesla also demonstrated vacuum tubes illuminated by wireless energy transmission, electricity sent through the air without wires. He displayed his rotating egg of Columbus, a copper egg that spun upright in a rotating magnetic field. And he created sheets of crackling high-frequency light between two insulated plates that a period account in the technical press described as a modified lightning discharge, accompanied by a noise audible anywhere within the Electricity Building. Visitors who had never seen electric light before, and in 1893 most Americans had not, walked through this exhibit and encountered what must have seemed like pure sorcery. Here was a man who could make light appear in a tube held in his bare hand, with no wire, no connection, no visible source of power. Here was a city blazing with the intensity of daylight after dark, powered by invisible currents running through conduits buried under the ground they were walking on. And here is the hook that pulls at me every time I read about this period. The White City ran on a power grid more advanced than most American cities would have for another decade. It ran on a technology that its primary inventor was simultaneously demonstrating in ways that went beyond what the official electrical system required. Tesla, in that same year, was already thinking about wireless power transmission. He was already thinking about sending electrical energy through the Earth itself. The fair gave him a platform and a real working system to demonstrate some of those ideas to the largest audience that any inventor had ever had access to. What happened to all of that infrastructure when the fair ended? Where did those 12 1,000 horsepower generators go? What happened to the underground cable network? The official record says dismantled, salvaged, sold for parts. But the timeline of that dismantling and the question of what was actually removed versus what might have remained in place beneath the grounds of Jackson Park, that is a question that deserves more attention than it usually gets. And before we can address the ending of the White City, we need to look at the man who designed it, because Daniel Burnham is a figure whose biography raises its own set of quiet questions. The architect and the blueprint Daniel Hudson Burnham was 45 years old when the world's Columbian Exposition opened its gates. He had already built a reputation as one of the most ambitious commercial architects in Chicago. His partnership with John Wellborn Root had produced landmark buildings including the Rookery and the Monadnock, both of which still stand. But the White City was something of a different order. It was not just the largest project he had ever undertaken. It was, by any measure, the most ambitious coordinated architectural undertaking in the history of the United States up to that point. Burnham's method of working on the fair is documented in correspondence at the Art Institute of Chicago's Ryerson and Burnham Archives, described by the Art Institute as the largest collection of materials on Burnham's life and work in existence. He established a headquarters building on the fairgrounds and essentially moved in, working from the site for the better part of 2 years. Multiple accounts describe his management style as close to military in its insistence on coordination, deadlines, and visual coherence across buildings designed by different hands. He chose a single architectural language for the main buildings of the Court of Honor. Beaux-Arts classicism, characterized by monumental scale, symmetry, classical column orders, rich sculptural decoration, and a vocabulary drawn from ancient Greece and Rome, filtered through the French École des Beaux-Arts. This choice was not without controversy. Louis Sullivan, whose transportation building was the one major structure that broke from the classical consensus with its polychromatic ornamental arch, later wrote that the damage wrought by the World's Fair will last for half a century. Sullivan believed that Burnham's choice had set back a genuinely American architecture by imposing a European historical vocabulary on a culture just beginning to find its own voice. The Art Institute's collection preserves both sides of this debate in the correspondence of the period. What Burnham actually believed about the permanence of what he was building, about what he thought it would do to the American mind, is something the record addresses only partially. His published writings emphasize the city beautiful concept, the idea that great public architecture could ennoble citizens and lift the aspirations of a democratic society. His lecture notes, portions of which are cited in the Burnham Finding Guides at the Art Institute, describe the Exposition as an attempt to show Americans what their cities could be if they chose greatness over mere utility. But there is a tension running through the planning of the fair that Burnham never fully resolved in writing. He commissioned buildings designed to look permanent, following every visual convention of monumental stone construction, not out of place in the Forum of ancient Rome, while knowing those buildings would be torn down when the fair ended. The structural engineer Edward Shankland, quoted in a period technical journal, observed that the iron and steel frames inside several pavilions were engineered to a higher standard than temporary construction required. The external staff cladding was impermanent by design. The internal skeleton, in some cases, was not. This is a detail that tends to get lost in popular treatments of the fair. The buildings looked temporary because they were clad in plaster, but the frames inside some of them were built to a standard that exceeded what temporary construction requires. Why? The standard explanation is that Burnham over-engineered for safety, that he was being cautious, as a responsible director of works should be, given the expected crowds. That is entirely plausible. But it does leave open a secondary possibility, that some of these frames were built with the implicit expectation that they might be reused or repurposed or retained in some form after the fair's official closing. Consider the Palace of Fine Arts. Of all the buildings on the Exposition grounds, this one received special treatment from the beginning. Its interior frame was built not of wood, but of brick. Its foundation was more substantial. Its design anticipated permanence even while the official plan classified it as a temporary structure. After the fair closed, it was retained, first as the Field Columbian Museum, which occupied it from 1893 until 1920, and then, after a major reconstruction in the late 1920s, as the Museum of Science and Industry, which it remains today. The Britannica records this reconstruction, noting that between 1928 and 1932, the building was rebuilt in permanent limestone. The bones were already there. Someone had planned for that outcome. Now here is the question that does not have a clean answer. If the planners were willing to build one structure with permanence in mind, why were all the others built so definitively to be temporary? What was the purpose of creating something so monumentally impressive, investing so much expertise and labor, attracting 27 million visitors, and then simply ending it? Burnham's own answer, the City Beautiful answer, is that it was a demonstration, a proof of concept. Look what we can build if we choose to. Now go home and demand this of your own cities. And that answer is historically real. The wave of neoclassical civic architecture that swept American cities in the decade after the fair is directly traceable to the white city's influence. City halls, libraries, courthouses, post offices from coast to coast were redesigned or rebuilt in the Beaux-Arts idiom that Burnham had made famous in Jackson Park. But demonstrations tend to leave records behind. The plans, the models, the engineering drawings, the detailed construction documents. For a project of this scale, you would expect an enormous paper trail. Some of that trail exists and is preserved. Some of it, notably the more detailed utility and underground infrastructure drawings, is either lost or not prominently cataloged. Whether that absence is simply the ordinary entropy of historical record-keeping or whether it reflects something more deliberate is a question I cannot answer for you. What I can tell you is that the absence is real, and it is worth asking about. If you want to go look at this yourself, and I encourage you to, The Ryerson and Burnham Archives at the Art Institute of Chicago is the place to start. The finding guides are publicly available. See what is there and notice also what is described as missing or unlocated. If you find something interesting, come back and tell me in the comments. This is exactly the kind of collective research that makes this community worth being part of. Subscribe to this channel if you want to be part of that ongoing conversation. Because what I am about to tell you next, about the 3 fires and the speed of destruction, is going to make you want to be in that discussion. 3 fires and a wrecking crew. The world's Columbian Exposition closed officially on October 30th, 1893. In the 27 months that followed, between that closing day and the spring of 1896, when the Chicago House Wrecking Company completed their salvage work, the White City essentially ceased to exist. What was accomplished in 26 months of construction was undone in slightly less time, and the mechanism of that undoing was not primarily the planned demolition that the official record emphasizes. It was fire. 3 significant fires in sequence, each one consuming structures that had taken months of skilled labor to erect. The first fire occurred not after the fair, but during it. On the evening of July 10, 1893, the Cold Storage Building, a Romanesque structure in the southwestern portion of the grounds, built by the Hercules Iron Works Company of Aurora, Illinois, caught fire. The blaze trapped workers in the building's tower, and the Chicago Daily Tribune's front-page report the following morning described the deaths of 16 people, 12 firefighters, and 4 civilians. The cause was never officially determined, though the building's chief engineer believed it started when electricians were wiring lights on a sign inside the structure. A coroner's jury convened on July 19th and charged Daniel Burnham himself, along with 3 others, with criminal negligence. All 4 were eventually absolved, but the case raised public questions about the standards under which this so-called temporary city was being built. The second fire came on January 8, 1894, barely 2 months after closing. It began in the casino adjacent to the peristyle, the grand gate of 13 columns representing the original 13 American states. According to a Chicago Tribune report from January 9th of that year, roughly 20,000 spectators gathered to watch it burn. The fire consumed the peristyle, the music hall, and the casino, and damaged structures throughout the Court of Honor. Newspaper accounts preserved in the Chicagology archive describe the crowd as oddly celebratory, not grieving, but satisfied, as though watching a fireworks display. One reporter noted that many observers felt destruction by fire was simply the best possible outcome. That public reaction is itself worth pausing on. There was no mass mourning for the White City. There was no organized campaign to save even portions of it. The most breathtaking collection of architecture assembled in American history to that point, visited by 27 million people in 6 months, was allowed to burn in front of tens of thousands of onlookers who seemed to have felt, broadly, that this was fine. The Chicago Tribune account suggests that some spectators actually hoped the remaining standing buildings would also catch and be consumed. What does that tell us about how people understood what the White City actually was? A third major fire followed on July 5, 1894. According to the detailed historical account maintained by the World's Fair Research Archive, this fire was reportedly arsonous in origin, as was the February 14th fire of that year, which damaged the South Colonnade. The July 5th blaze was the largest. It consumed 7 major buildings simultaneously. The administration building with its famous gilded dome, the terminal station, the mines and mining building, the electricity building, the building where Tesla had demonstrated wireless light and crackling high-frequency discharges, the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, which had been the largest enclosed space on Earth, the Agricultural Building, Machinery Hall, 7 of the great palaces of the White City, gone in a single night. After the fire, a single structure stood essentially untouched in the center of what had become a field of charred iron and blackened plaster. Daniel Chester French's 65-foot gilded statue of the Republic, the female figure of American nationhood that had presided over the Grand Basin throughout the Exposition. She stood there through 3 years of decay, unmoved, until the morning of August 28, 1896, when that too was consumed by fire. The historical account notes, almost as an aside, that Frederick Law Olmsted died on exactly that same day, 7 years later, to the date, in 1903. A coincidence, certainly, but a strange one. The Chicago House Wrecking Company completed its salvage work on May 22, 1896. Of the more than 200 buildings that had stood on the Exposition grounds, 3 remained: the Palace of Fine Arts, the German Building, and the Convent of La Rabida. Everything else had been burned or demolished. The 630-acre site was returned to public park use. Jackson Park, as it is today, sits over the footprint of the White City. Now, the fires themselves are documented. The dates, the buildings, the casualty counts, the newspaper coverage. All of this is in the record, verifiable, cross-referenced. What is less clearly documented is the investigation into the arson fires. The July 1894 fire was described in contemporaneous accounts as arsonous, but no one was ever charged in connection with it. The February 1894 fire was similarly characterized without a definitive prosecutorial outcome. Who set those fires? The record does not clearly say. One strand of the historical interpretation, the conventional one, holds that the arson fires were set by labor agitators or unemployed workers who had taken up residence in the fair buildings after the Exposition closed. The Pullman strike of 1894 was underway at the time of the July fire, and the labor tensions of that summer were extreme. Federal troops had been deployed in Chicago, a plausible enough context for arson. But there is another reading of the sequence that some researchers have found compelling, and I want to lay it out for you without endorsing it as definitively true, because the evidence does not fully support that kind of certainty. The reading goes like this: the buildings of the White City were always intended to be destroyed. Not accidentally, not by neglect, but deliberately. The plaster over iron construction was the first mechanism of destruction. It ensured that the buildings could never credibly be preserved as the permanent monuments they resembled. The fires were the second mechanism. They provided a dramatic, public, emotionally satisfying ending that explained why the buildings were gone. And the speed of the subsequent demolition, the Chicago House Wrecking Company completing its work just 2.5 years after closing, was the third mechanism, ensuring that no detailed physical examination of the structures would ever be possible. What you are left with is photographs, thousands of photographs, taken primarily by Charles Dudley Arnold under contract with the Exposition Corporation. Those photographs are the primary visual record of the White City. They are extraordinary documents, and they were, from the beginning, officially commissioned and officially controlled. What do you think is really going on here? Does the simplest explanation satisfy you, that the fair was built quickly, run successfully, and then ended in the chaotic fires that tend to claim temporary structures? Or does this feel like something that was carefully managed from beginning to end, in ways that the official record was never quite designed to fully expose? Tell me in the comments. I mean that genuinely, not as a prompt, but as a real question. Because the next piece of this story is the one that gets under your skin the most. The legacy question. Let us be precise about what we actually know, what we suspect, and what remains genuinely open. Because the White City story has been picked up in recent years by a community of alternative history researchers who have made claims about it that go considerably beyond what the documented evidence supports. And if we are serious about this kind of investigation, we have to be honest about where the evidence ends and where speculation begins. Here is what the documented record firmly establishes. The world's Columbian Exposition opened on May 1, 1893, on a 630-acre site in Jackson Park on Chicago's South Side. It ran for 6 months and attracted more than 27 million visitors, roughly 1 in 3 Americans alive at the time. 46 nations participated. The total gross expenditure, according to Britannica's figure drawn from period financial reports, was approximately $28,340,000. It was the first American international exposition to close with a financial profit. The electrical system was designed by George Westinghouse using Nikola Tesla's AC polyphase technology, deployed through 12 1,000-horsepower generators, and produced energy output 3 times greater than the concurrent consumption of the city of Chicago. The buildings were clad in a material called staff, plaster of Paris with cement and fibrous reinforcement, over wood and iron frames, applied in many cases by compressed air spray painting equipment. The construction required a workforce of more than 40,000 at peak, beginning in January 1891, with the fair opening in May 1893. After closing, 3 significant fires destroyed the majority of structures between January 1894 and July 1894. The Chicago House Wrecking Company completed removal of remaining structures by May 22, 1896. Today, one original building survives in place, the Palace of Fine Arts, which reopened after a major reconstruction as the Museum of Science and Industry in 1933. The World's Congress Auxiliary Building was also retained and became the current home of the Art Institute of Chicago. Now here is what the record leaves genuinely open and what deserves continued attention from anyone willing to do the archival work. First, the underground infrastructure, the cable conduits, service passages, and utility connections buried beneath a site consuming 3 times Chicago's entire electrical load represent a major engineering achievement in their own right. The construction records for that infrastructure, plans, specifications, as-built drawings, are either lost, uncatalogued, or not accessible through the major archival collections. The Art Institute's Burnham collection does not specifically account for utility construction drawings at the engineering level. That gap may be entirely ordinary. It may also be one of the most interesting unresolved questions in the history of the exposition. Second, the speed and completeness of the demolition. The Chicago House Wrecking Company's contract explicitly excluded the Statue of the Republic, an omission that seems curious for a thorough demolition operation. The Republic stood in the ruins for 3 years, deteriorating before its final fire in 1896. Why excluded? The record does not clearly say. The conventional answer, the buildings were temporary by design, the land was needed as park space, is coherent. But complete explanations have a way of being slightly too complete. Third, the influence question. The White City's impact on American architecture is not disputed. Beaux-Arts classicism became the template for civic buildings nationwide: courthouses, post offices, train stations, libraries, city halls, all communicating permanence, authority, historical continuity with the ancient world. The White City introduced that visual grammar to 27 million people in 6 months, and then vanished, leaving the lesson implanted while removing the original. Sullivan's complaint that the fair set back American architecture by a generation was accurate as description, whatever one thinks of his evaluation. If you were trying to reset the visual culture of a young nation, to replace whatever architectural vocabulary had been developing organically with something more explicitly classical, more explicitly referential to the authority of the ancient world, you could not have designed a more effective mechanism than the White City. Build it impossibly fast, make it impossibly grand, show it to 1 in 3 Americans, then take it away before anyone can examine it too carefully. Leave the lesson. Remove the evidence. Let the copies, the courthouses, the libraries, the post offices, do the long-term work of normalization. Is that what actually happened? I genuinely cannot tell you that it was. The people who planned the fair, Burnham, Olmsted, Hunt, McKim, St. Gaudens, left records. Their city beautiful philosophy was a real philosophy, sincerely held with a genuine intellectual tradition behind it. There is no document in which any of them states a hidden purpose. The absence of such a document is not evidence of one. The conventional history of the White City is coherent, well-sourced, and intellectually serious. And yet, the questions persist. Underground infrastructure underdocumented, worker records thin, fires convenient, demolition total, legacy enormous. The structure of the story, enormous investment, public unveiling, mass audience, total erasure, follows a pattern that shows up in other contexts, in other periods. The historian Henry Adams, writing about the fair in his autobiography published posthumously in 1918, called it the first expression of American thought as unity, a recognition that the White City had achieved something culturally coherent in a nation that was young and deeply uncertain about its identity. But unity is not a neutral word. Unity requires that certain things be brought together and certain others left out. The White City included 46 nations, but did not meaningfully represent the indigenous peoples on whose land Jackson Park had been built. The Potawatomi leader Simon Paukagon sold a birch bark booklet at the fair's entrance, preserved today in several archival collections, describing what the event meant from the perspective of those whose history it had quietly erased. That document is one of the few records of a perspective the official photographic record has very little room for. What gets built into the foundations of a culture's visual identity is not a neutral process. The White City was a deliberate act of world-building, a city conjured in 2 years, shown to a generation, and then dissolved. Whether that conjuring was simply the grandest expression of American ambition ever assembled, or whether it was something more calculated than that, is a question that the record invites but does not settle. And that, I think, is exactly where we should leave it for now. Not with a clean answer, with a clean question, one that you can take with you when you walk through the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, the one remaining building, rebuilt in permanent limestone, standing in the place where the temporary palace once stood. Ask yourself as you walk through it what it is that a building this grand, in this place, is really trying to say to you, whose authority it is invoking, whose history it is encoding. Then come back here and tell me what you found. If this investigation left you with more questions than you started with, which is honestly the best outcome I can hope for, then subscribe to EPOCH RESET right now. Because this is what we do here, episode after episode. We find the places where the official story has a seam in it, and we pull carefully, with attention to what the actual evidence says and what it does not. The 19th century is full of those seams. We have barely started. The next case file we are opening involves another vanishing, a city that appeared on American maps for decades, drew settlers, built institutions, maintained a post office and a railroad depot, and then simply stopped being referenced, not destroyed, not renamed, simply and quietly dropped from the record while the land it occupied was absorbed and reclassified without public explanation. If the White City was built too fast, this other place disappeared too cleanly, and the question of why haunts the researchers who have tried to trace it back. I will see you there, and in the meantime, be in the comments. The best part of this community is what you bring to it. A question, a source, a detail from your own research, a piece of regional history that connects to something we discussed today. All of it matters. Drop it below. I read everything. This has been Elliot Carter for EPOCH RESET. Until next time.